It was discovered at that time Terry Bollea, also known as Hulk Hogan, was experiencing a serious medical-related issue. Personnel provided medical treatment at that time and transported Mr. Bollea to Morton Plant Hospital, where he died at 11:17 a.m.
On a warm Thursday morning in Clearwater, Florida, the world's most recognizable wrestler stopped breathing in his own living room. Within hours, the name Hulk Hogan was trending everywhere. Within a year, his death had been picked apart by tabloids, retold by conspiracy channels, and finally, closed for good by the very police department that opened the file. This is the real story, not the internet's version of it, but the one backed by a 72-page police report, a family-funded autopsy, and the people who were actually in the room when Terry Bollea took his last breath. Terry Gene Bollea had been Hulk Hogan for so long that most of the world had forgotten the two names belonged to different people. Hogan was the character, the 24-inch pythons, the red and yellow, the brother tacked onto the end of every sentence. Bollea was the 71-year-old man underneath, a man whose body had spent nearly 5 decades being thrown, slammed, and rebuilt by surgeons. On the morning of July 24, 2025, Bollea was at home on El Dorado Avenue with his wife, Sky Daly Hogan. Also present were a home health aide named Dana Swinton and an occupational therapist, Justin McCamey, who had only been working with Hogan for about 2 weeks. McCamey had arrived roughly 10 minutes before Hogan stopped breathing. At 9:51 a.m., Sky called 911. The call, later released as part of the police report, captured her voice cracking as she told the dispatcher, "My husband, it doesn't seem like he's breathing." While she stayed on the line, Sky, Dana, and Justin began CPR, trading off compressions until Clearwater Fire Department paramedics arrived and took over. Firefighters and paramedics worked on him at the house before rushing him to Morton Plant Hospital. At 11:17 a.m., doctors pronounced Terry Bollea dead. The initial explanation was simple: a heart attack. And for a man in his 70s with a documented history of heart trouble, that explanation held up. But because this wasn't just any 71-year-old man, this was Hulk Hogan, arguably the single most recognizable athlete-entertainer of the 20th century. The death didn't stay simple for long. To understand what actually killed Hulk Hogan, you have to understand what his body had already survived. This wasn't a healthy man who dropped dead out of nowhere. This was a man managing multiple serious conditions at once, some of them for years. Hogan had chronic lymphocytic leukemia, or CLL, a slow-moving blood cancer that affects white blood cells and bone marrow. He also lived with atrial fibrillation, an irregular and often rapid heart rhythm that significantly raises the risk of stroke and cardiac arrest. In the weeks before his death, family members told investigators he had also been dealing with pneumonia and kidney failure. And in the years leading up to 2025, he had gone through more than 24 surgeries. On his back, his hips, his knees, his shoulders, the accumulated cost of a career spent absorbing impact for a living. The most significant of those procedures happened just weeks before his death. In May 2025, Hogan underwent a 4-level anterior cervical discectomy and fusion, ACDF for short, a major spinal surgery in which damaged discs in the neck are removed and adjacent vertebrae are fused together to stabilize the spine and relieve pressure on the nerves. It's a serious operation at any age. At 71, with Hogan's medical history, it carried real risk. Rumors about how the surgery had gone began circulating almost immediately. Radio personality Bubba the Love Sponge told his audience that Hogan was in critical condition and might not survive. Sky Daly pushed back publicly, saying her husband was not in a coma, that his heart was strong, and that he was recovering. In the weeks that followed, Hogan was photographed smiling with fans and appeared to be working his way back toward his normal routine. His son Nick later described him as more focused on his health than he had been in years. So when Hogan died 2 months later, the timing was impossible to ignore. Had the surgery, and not just his heart, played a role? This is where the story actually gets interesting. Not because of a hidden room or a mysterious phone call, but because of one unscripted comment made by an exhausted man in the middle of an emergency. In the chaotic minutes after Hogan stopped breathing, occupational therapist Justin McCamey The man who had been treating Hogan for only 2 weeks made a statement to first responders suggesting that Hogan's death might be connected to nerve damage from the recent spinal surgery. Specifically, he raised the possibility that the phrenic nerve, which controls the diaphragm and therefore breathing itself, had been damaged during the ACDF procedure. If that nerve is injured during cervical spine surgery, it can, in rare cases, lead to respiratory failure. That comment spread fast. It had all the ingredients social media loves: a beloved public figure, a serious medical claim, and a source who sounded like he knew what he was talking about. Within days, Hulk Hogan's surgeon severed his nerve had become an accepted fact in comment sections and video essays across the internet, even though it had never been confirmed by anyone qualified to make that determination. When Clearwater police formally interviewed McCamey as part of their investigation, the story changed. He clarified that he was not a neurosurgeon, that his professional relationship with Hogan had lasted barely 2 weeks, and that he had been speaking in the immediate aftermath of performing CPR on a man he'd just watched die. Hardly the ideal circumstances for a precise clinical diagnosis. He acknowledged he had been speaking out of turn. Genuine multi-agency emergency response, not the kind of detail a cover-up narrative tends to produce. The report also documents the full chain of medical evidence: the initial 911 call and dispatch, the on-scene resuscitation efforts, the transport to Morton Plant Hospital, the time of death, the medical examiner's initial cardiac arrest determination, the cremation approval report from the District 6 medical examiner's office noting his atrial fibrillation and leukemia, and finally the independent family commission autopsy that echoed the same conclusion using its own forensic language. Natural disease, no trauma, no toxicology, findings of concern. Perhaps most tellingly, the report explicitly acknowledges why the investigation took as long as it did and why it was handled with unusual care in the first place. Clearwater police stated plainly that because of who Hogan was and because early statements, like the occupational therapist's retracted comment, had raised concerns, it fell to the department to formally address, challenge, or validate those concerns rather than simply accept the initial natural death determination. In other words, the thoroughness that conspiracy theories later cited as evidence something was being hidden was, in the department's own words, precisely the opposite: due diligence performed in public view, on the record, specifically because Hogan's fame meant vague rumors needed to be run down and closed out rather than left to fester. When the report closed the case as solved, non-criminal, it did so not by ignoring the swirl of online speculation, but by directly investigating and ruling out the very claims that speculation was built on, and finding nothing. No forced entry, no altered security footage, no unexplained visitors, no toxicology red flags. Just an extensively corroborated account of a sick, elderly man's heart giving out at home, surrounded by people who try to save him. One of the most overlooked parts of this story is also one of the most human: the small group of people who were physically present with Hogan when he died, and what that morning actually looked like for them. Sky Daly Hogan was not a bystander in someone else's tragedy. She was his wife, in the house, the one who noticed something was wrong and made the 911 call, her voice audibly breaking as she described her husband not breathing. In the aftermath, she described his death on social media as sudden and impossible to process, while acknowledging that he had, in fact, been dealing with some health issues, a private acknowledgement made before the internet had built its version of events that lines up precisely with what the medical record later confirmed. Dana Swinton, the home health aide, and Justin McCamey, the occupational therapist, were both professional caregivers brought in to help manage Hogan's recovery from his recent surgery. Further evidence, if any were needed, that this was a household actively managing a serious, ongoing medical situation, not one blindsided by an otherwise healthy man's sudden collapse. Both performed CPR alongside Sky in the minutes before paramedics arrived. McCamey, as covered earlier, made the comment that would later fuel months of speculation, but it's worth remembering the context one more time. This was a man with 2 weeks of professional history with Hogan, in the immediate, adrenaline-soaked aftermath of watching a patient die in front of him and trying to save his life with his own hands. However, the comment was later amplified online, In the room, it was said, it was one caregiver trying to make sense of a devastating morning out loud. Clearwater Police's closing statement made a point of thanking this exact group, Sky, Nick, Brooke, and the family's attorney, for their cooperation, specifically noting how difficult it must have been to hand over deeply personal medical information while actively grieving. That's not the language of an investigation that uncovered a cover-up. It's the language of investigators who spent months working closely with a grieving family to make sure the public record was accurate. There's one more distinction worth making before wrapping up, because it explains a lot about why this story took the shape it did online. The gap between Hulk Hogan the character and Terry Bollea the man. For most of the public, Hulk Hogan wasn't really a person. He was an idea. Invincibility. 24-inch pythons that never got smaller no matter how old the man attached to them got. A voice that always sounded like it was mid-promo, even in casual interviews. That character was built deliberately over decades to feel larger and tougher than any ordinary human being, and it worked extraordinarily well. Generations of fans grew up believing, almost without thinking about it, that Hulk Hogan simply couldn't be brought down by something as mundane as a heart attack. Terry Bollea, on the other hand, was a 71-year-old man with cancer, an irregular heartbeat, a fused cervical spine, and a body held together by the accumulated wear of a profession that doesn't offer much of a retirement plan for its joints. When that man's heart finally stopped, a significant portion of the public reaction wasn't really grief for Terry Bollea specifically. It was disbelief that Hulk Hogan, the character, could die at all. That disbelief is exactly the emotional space conspiracy content moves into. It's far easier, psychologically, to accept that a legend was taken by something dramatic and hidden than to accept that even legends are, underneath the persona, ordinary aging body subject to ordinary risks. Understanding that gap doesn't erase the real, complicated parts of Hogan's life. His messy divorces, his estrangement from Brooke, the controversies that damaged his public standing in his later career. Those are documented, real, and part of an honest account of who he was. But they belong in a different category entirely from invented details about secret rooms and untraceable phone calls. One is complicated human history. The other is fiction dressed up as investigative journalism. Hulk Hogan's death was never actually a mystery. It was the natural, well-documented end of a man whose body had absorbed nearly 50 years of extraordinary physical punishment, compounded by cancer, a heart condition, and a major surgery just weeks before he died. The Clearwater Police Department spent nearly a year confirming exactly that, working through witness statements, medical records, and an independent family-funded autopsy before closing the case with no evidence of anything other than a natural death. What made the story spread wasn't evidence. It was one exhausted man's unscripted comment in the middle of an emergency, a family with real and long-standing tension, and an audience primed to believe that someone as larger-than-life as Hulk Hogan couldn't possibly have died from something as ordinary as a bad heart. But he did, and maybe that's the more honest tribute. Not a manufactured mystery, but the truth that even the toughest man in wrestling was, in the end, just a man.